Today, we're picking up where we left off in the story of chidush hasemicha. We'll look at what unfolded after Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib pushed back against Rabbi Yaakov Beirav's plan, and how the controversy evolved in the decades that followed. We'll dive into what Rabbi Yosef Caro's role in this debate was, and then turn to the remarkable mission in the 1830s, spearheaded by Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov, then living in Tzfas, to find the 10 lost tribes in his bold attempt to revive Semicha. So today we're continuing the story of the controversy associated with the attempt to renew Semicha in the 1530s in Eretz Yisrael. And in the last class we looked at the writings between Rabbi Yaakov Beirav from Tzfas, who supported this initiative and who in fact received the Semicha through the method discussed last week. He was on one side, and on the other side was Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib, who was the Rav in Yerushalayim. And last week we focused on the arguments and the sources, the academic side of their discussion and their debate. Where we want to pick up the story today is by noting the following: that even in the Ksav Haskama that we saw last week, the agreement that the Chachmei Tzfas wrote up saying what they did, there was only one person who received Semicha in that Ksav Haskama, and that one person was Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. It said that he has reshus, that he has permission to give other people Semicha, but it doesn't say that he gave to anyone other than to Rav Levi ibn Chabib. And that is, he sent a ksav to Yerushalayim that he's giving Semicha, so the number 2 was going to be the Ralbach. For Poyel, we know from last week already, the Ralbach said that he rejected it. A person has a right to reject the Semicha. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Yudalit, says that Reb Meir once rejected a Semicha that he received from Rabbi Akiva. So in other words, a person has the ability to reject it. So Ralbach rejected it, which means that at that moment, there was only one person in the world who had this Semicha, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. But Pashtus, what was going on is that nothing continued. He didn't go and give Semicha to anyone else. In order to do Dinei Knesses, you need 3. You need to have 3 that have Semicha. And B'Poyel, he didn't nominate anyone else because he was waiting. What was he waiting for? He was waiting for an agreement. B'Poyel, when news came from Yerushalayim that Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib was against it, so now what happens? So it becomes a little bit of a tumult. What are we going to do? So where we want to begin today is we want to pick up at this moment of doubt and this moment of ambiguity in Tzfas and see the Hemshech HaMaisa of what happened. We know what Rabbi Yaakov Beirav's position is, and we know that he's a Musmach already. We know that Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib doesn't like it. No. So what's going to happen now? So at this point,
what is the significance of the whole thing altogether?
The significance of the Semicha we spoke about last shir, and Bekitzer, I'll just repeat right now, on a very basic level, you would have the ability to give Malchus, you would have the ability to be Dan Dinei Knesses, you would have the ability to start a Sanhedrin and have an official Sanhedrin, and as well, theoretically, if you wanted to, you could revisit the conversation of the calendar, and that is Kiddush HaChodesh. So all these different elements, to do it al pi Re'iyah, all these different elements were part of the conversation that we spoke about in the prior shir. Okay, so like this. At this point in the story, Rabbi Yosef Caro, the very famous Rabbi Yosef Caro, the author of the Beis Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch, comes into the picture. Why? Because what happens is as follows. Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib writes in one of his kontreisim, he writes to Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, by the way, I got information that after you guys heard up north that I'm against it, some of you had a doubt and you got cold feet and you weren't sure if we should go ahead with this or not. Well, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav responded to this claim in his kuntras and says, what are you talking about? There's doubt in Tzfas? Someone has doubt because of what you said in Tzfas? No one has any doubt about anything in Tzfas. In fact, he goes, and here, read the first passage. He says, I'll tell you exactly what happened after we heard about your doubt. After the shliach, remember last week we learned about Reb Shlomo Chazan, who was the shliach, who brought the Ksav Semicha to Yerushalayim. So after Shlomo Chazan came back up north, Chazru v'kaimua. All the Chachamim in Tzfas, it doesn't say all, but the consensus of the Chachamim in Tzfas is they revisited the issue. Is Levi ibn Chabib right? No, he's not right. Chazru v'kaimu. They endorsed again their own Semicha. The one that they did, and they accepted it as binding. And everyone knows this. Even you know this. Even you know this, Ralbach. Why? Because you got upset at the people who signed the document. In other words, what happened was the rabbis in Tzfas, they made another meeting. They heard, you hear, Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib is against it. Should we change our mind? No, we're not changing our mind. And what do? They wrote the document. And they signed the document. And he calls it here a kuntres. And what do they do with the kuntres? They sent it to Yerushalayim. They sent it to Ralbach. And Ralbach here, according to Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, was upset by this. And he said, how do I know he was upset? He was upset because he sent a return message to Rabbi Yosef Caro protesting the tone of this letter. So what does that prove? That proves you know that we reconvened. We established that we like this idea, and you know about it. How do I know you know about it? Because you wrote back in protest on the tone and the language. And in a later letter, Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib actually says, you're right, I actually agree with you. I was upset about the letter, and I wrote to Rabbi Yosef Caro, and I wrote him that it was disrespectful, whatever he wrote, not for my personal covet, but simply because he's writing to a Bezin Yerushalayim, and it has to be written respectfully. So in other words, what we see over here is at this moment, what happened was, at this moment of pause where nothing is moving forward, we know that Rabbi Yosef Caro enters the story because the fact that Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib sends a letter being upset dafka to him means that he was probably the primary author of this document, supporting the Chachamim and Tzvas, and that's going to be important because we're going to return to Rabbi Yosef Caro later on to witness his role in this story, and right now his role in this story is an ardent supporter of Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. But at the end of the day, what we're holding right now is still, it appears, that the Chachamim and Tzvas still are not ready to go ahead. At the end of the day, you have a voice in Yerushalayim, someone who's protesting no, and it appears that at this moment in time, they say, so what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We think yes, he thinks no, what are we going to do? So very often in these situations, you say, let's ask a third opinion. And it appears that at this moment, they turn to a third opinion. Now, who's going to be the third opinion? So in Eretz Yisrael, it was just in these two cities, the big Rabbanim. Where's the closest place where you have big Rabbanim right now? Is in Egypt. And the greatest name in Egypt at the time was Radbaz, Reb David ibn Zimra, who later is going to come to Yerushalayim and to Tzfas. But at this point, he's living in Cairo. And it appears from a passage Radbaz wrote that it's at this moment that they asked him to kind of take his temperature and then determine what their next move is going to be. How do we know about this? We know about this because Radbaz wrote a commentary to the Rambam, Hilchas Sanhedrin. Rambam Hilchas Sanhedrin Perek Dalid. That's where the Rambam has this passage and where he writes, Nirli Advarim, that if we want, we could bring back Semicha. So Radbaz stellt sich on this, and he says as follows: Al Lashon Zeh, about on this language that the Rambam uses here, some chuchachs made tzvas, so the rabbis at tzvas relied on this, v'hagadol shabehem, including the great one among them, referring to Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, lismoich smuchin ladun dinei knosses, to set up smicha in order to do dinei knosses. However, because I'm upset that you could do this. V'loi Allah biyadam, it didn't work. Now what does it mean it didn't work? So we know in this passage he's writing, we know he wrote this pirush years later. He didn't write this in 1538. He wrote this when he moved to Eretz Yisrael. And I know that he was in Egypt at least for 10 years after 1538. So a good number of years, at least a decade after, he moved to Eretz Yisrael. He was in Yerushalayim. He writes that in Yerushalayim is where he wrote this pirush. So he's looking back and saying, 10, 15 years earlier, Lo Allah biyadam, it didn't work. Now, what does it mean it didn't work? So on one level, you could say is he doesn't agree. And as we're going to learn, he actually didn't agree. More or less, he sides with Ralbach, not with Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. So that's what it can mean, v'lo yala b'yadam. But it's not really mashma that. V'lo yala b'yadam doesn't mean I don't agree. Then you say, I didn't agree. Lo yala b'yadam means that even they would have to acknowledge that it didn't work. Which raises the question, really? Did the Chachamim and Tzvas really acknowledge that it didn't work, because as we're going to see, for decades thereafter, many decades thereafter, there was an assumption that this is actually working on some level, as we're going to see later. And so therefore, it raises the question, what does he mean, v'lo ya'ala b'yadam? But on a basic level, even after everything we're going to see in the future in this year, of how the Chachamim and Tzfas, at least some of them, did think they had something going for decades thereafter, at the end of the day, none of them ever sat down and did in Knesses. None of them did Chatzi Nezek for a Shur. None of them did a Kefel for a Ganev, etc., etc., etc. So that's what he means over here, that even if it achieved something, the legally, practically, on the ground, concrete difference, lo ya'ala b'yadam, and even they would have to acknowledge that. Why? Why didn't it work? The rabbi in Yerushalayim didn't agree with them. And here he says his piece. While I was still living in Mitzrayim, they asked me. Now the question is, who's they? Who's the they that asked me? So in this passage, the plural is always going on Chachmei Tzfas. The Rabach is a singular. So Visha'alu es pi ba'odim b'Mitzrayim lends itself more to suggest that it was the rabbis in Tzfas that asked him while I was still in Mitzrayim. So years ago they asked me this question. Ves pi chaverai, and the other rabbis on the Bezdin in Mitzrayim. V'lo hiskamnu, and we did not agree. V'ani arachti b'oisa tshuva levatol daitam, and I wrote a long tshuva negating their views. And then he goes on in his commentary here to summarize the points that he wrote 15 or so years earlier in his tshuva, and many of those points match perfectly with Ralbach's points. In other words, Radvaz and Ralbach were pretty good allies, and it seems that the rabbis in Tzfas asked Radvaz because they needed some leverage against Yerushalayim, but they weren't getting it, because it turns out that the answer that they got was a no. Now, along the way, he makes many points similar to Ralbach. There's one point I want to highlight now because it's going to be relevant in the future. And that is when he talks about, so then how are we going to get Semicha back? If we're not going to do this, how are we ever going to get Semicha back? So one of the points he says is that the Bnei Reuven, the tribe of Reuven, Asidim Lavei Velases Mochames Lifnei Boy Melech HaMashiach. They are one of the lost tribes. And they are going to return and engage in war before Mashiach's coming. This is based on a passage in Zohar, Parshas Vayechi, which says that originally when the Yidden went into Eretz Yisrael, who went ahead of the pack? Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe. They said they're going to go ahead. The Zohar seems to say that of the three, who went ahead of all the heads? Reuven. And that's what's going to also happen. La'asid Lavei, that Reuven is going to come back before Mashiach and is going to lead in the wars. So one of the big things we discussed last week was it needs to be back before Mashiach, because the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnah said that Chazar Hasemicha is going to be before Mashiach. But how are you going to have it before Mashiach? So that led Rambam and Rabbi Beirav to say what? That we're going to recreate it on our own, as we discussed last week. So Radvaz is saying, amongst his many points of disagreeing, is why do you need to do that? It could happen before Mashiach, and how's it going to happen before Mashiach? Because we're going to have the Bnei Reuven. How are they going to help us? Because who's to tell us that they don't have someone who's samach mipi samach? In other words, they're continuing the line of smicha. It was an isbatel by us, as we spoke about the circumstances of that last week, but it was never an isbatel from them, so they could do the smicha. Now this raises an obvious question. The Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Yudalit says that smicha cannot be given outside Eretz Yisrael. And the Aseres HaShvatim presumably aren't present in Eretz Yisrael. We'll return to that question later on. But anyway, this is one of the points that Radvaz mentions, again, amongst many other points, siding with Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib rather than Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. He concludes and says, if you want to understand all of my points, check out that tshuva that I wrote back then. Unfortunately, that tshuva does not survive. And by the way, I should point out now that Rabbi Yosef Caro's letter that we referenced earlier that made Ralbach upset, and Ralbach's letter in response protesting, those letters have not been preserved either. So all of some material survives. Some of the points, letters that we've referenced just now have not survived. So, Al Kopanim, what do we see from here? We see initially, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav was the only one who was a samuch. He gave smicha to Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib, it was rejected. So right now, again, he's the only one who has smicha. He did not proceed with the next step. Presumably, he was waiting for the haskama from Yerushalayim. When he didn't get that, they probably turned to Radvaz and Sfas. Now he didn't get that. He didn't even get that. So now what? Now, not only is the situation worse, Yerushalayim said no, and Egypt said no, but everyone in Sfas still thinks yes. So what do you do now? So it doesn't take a lot to understand that this probably led to a degree of paralysis. And that is within Sfas itself, different views. You could imagine people who support it say, I know I support it, but if two of these big or prominent Rabbanim are against it, both in Cairo and Yerushalayim, who are we to proceed? And you could imagine them themselves debating about what the next step should be. And the reality is that as we're soon going to see, for a number of months, there's no progress. There's just paralysis, and then it's going to change. And what prompts it to change is an emergency, is the feeling like if we don't do something now, we're going to lose everything. That's going to prompt it to change, and finally that's going to lead Rabbi Yaakov Beirav to go ahead and give smicha to 4 individuals. So this brings us back to a passage in Rabbi Yaakov Beirav's Kuntris, the Igeres HaSmicha, where he writes as follows. In the year 1538, God inspired the Chachamim of Eretz Yisrael, and almost everyone agreed that there should be smicha. There was only 1 or 2, and they are batul b'miot. Remember, his position is ruboy kekula. You do not need all the Chachamim of Eretz Yisrael. That was something that was contested, as we saw last week. And the result of this haskama was v'skimu v'samchuli. They all agreed, and they gave smicha to me. Ani atzoyer, I, the modest, the young individual, Ba'alpi, Yaakov Beirav. Okay. After 2 or 3 months passed, an emergency arose, and it was an emergency that something almost like happened to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava was about to happen to me, and this was going to prompt me to act. So in other words, you see very clearly here, he's saying 2-3 months I didn't do anything. Why? What was going on? As I said before, those 2-3 months was the time of seeing what Yerushalayim is going to say, hearing the no, seeing what Cairo is going to say. Those 2-3 months they were occupied with that and this period of paralysis. But now something is going to happen similar to the Ma'aser of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and that's going to prompt him to act. What's the Ma'aser of Yehuda ben Bava? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Yud Gimel, Amud Beis, Daf Yud Dalet, Amud Aleph, tells the story that the Roman government, sometime in the 2nd century, made a gzeira, Malchus Harashar, usually refers to the Roman government. They made a shmad against the Yidden, against smicha. Anyone who gives smicha is going to be killed. Anyone who receives smicha is going to be killed. And any city in which smicha takes place is going to be destroyed. In other words, collective punishment. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava wanted to keep smicha alive. He went between 2 great mountains. Presumably, the idea is that he's concealed and it's hard to access that. And between 2 cities, in other words, it's not happening in any city, so now the Romans won't be able to destroy any city. And he and his students go on Mesiras Nefesh. And he gives smicha to 5 rabbis: Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, that's Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua. These are the same 5 students of Rabbi Akiva, the 5 surviving students. The Gemara in Yavamas Daf Samach Beis says that there was a plague that took the lives of many, many students of Rabbi Akiva, and there were 5 who survived. It's the same 5, which actually raises a question. So what happened? Why didn't Rabbi Akiva give them smicha? But maybe more on that in a second. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava takes these 5 and he's going to give them smicha. What happens is the Romans bust them. So when the Romans are coming, he tells the students, you guys run away, I'm staying put over here. The Mefarshim explained he figured that he was too old, he wouldn't be able to run anyway. And in addition, he wanted to serve as a decoy. And that's exactly what happened. And the Romans came, and he was murdered in a brutal way. And he's one of the Asara, Harugei Malchus, and the people who were killed al Kiddush Hashem during this period in time. This is where the Gemara says, why is Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava giving Rabbi Akiva, giving Rabbi Meir smicha? Rabbi Meir already received smicha from his teacher Rabbi Akiva. And it says, no, because he was too young. Rabbi Meir rejected it from Rabbi Akiva. And Rashi explains, because he was too young. And so this was at a later date that that Yehuda ben Bava gave it to Reb Meir, and that's the story. So what happened here? A rabbi died al Kiddush Hashem to keep Semicha alive. Why didn't the Romans like it? So we spoke about it a little last week. The Romans, they presumably thought the Sanhedrin was a powerful institution, and it gives Jews hope of glory, of independence, of future government. So now they're going to revolt, take away their institutions, and hopefully they'll lose this idea, this aspiration for national independence. It could be that's the reason. And there could be other reasons. And so what's Rabbi Beirav? What's Rabbi Yaakov Beirav doing? He's saying that I almost had a Maisa like that. In other words, I also almost died. And now let's continue. Let's go back and hear his voice. How did he almost die? Number 6. Shakamu alai shnei malshinim al loy chamas bekapi. Because two people reported me to the Ottoman government, saying terrible things about me. In reality, I didn't do anything wrong. And I had to leave. Basically, I had to flee Tzfas. I couldn't be here anymore because of this Mesira. So now I thought to myself, he says, God forbid the hour is going to pass and we're going to lose the opportunity. I'm going to go to Chutz La'aretz, and Chutz La'aretz, you're not allowed to do smicha. So it's going to come out that everything that we worked on is going to be for nothing. Because look how hard it is to get everyone together to agree. In other words, especially now when he heard the descent from Yerushalayim and the descent from Cairo, so he no longer takes it for granted the fact that in Tzfas they got everyone to agree. It's like, I don't know that we're going to ever be able to do this again. And who knows if I'm ever going to come back to Eretz Yisrael. It's a dangerous situation. So, lachein samachti la'arba skenim b'chachma. I gave smicha then to 4 people. Again, he's clear. This is a few months after he initially received smicha. Mivchar ma'achavedim ha'ninsoim sham bizman hazeh, from the best of the Talmidei Chachamim who are there today. In other words, it sounds like he's writing this. He's not in Eretz Yisrael at this time. When he's writing this Igeres HaSmicha, he's still in a fleeing situation. And this is what he's writing here. Now, what's he comparing himself to? Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava went a Mesiras Nefesh to give smicha, and the Romans didn't want him to give smicha, so that's why they're chasing him and killing him. Here, the Ottomans aren't chasing him, don't have any problem with him doing smicha. They're completely oblivious, apparently, to what's going on. It's them. There's some malshinus over here, and as we're going to see in a second, Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib is going to call him out on that. He doesn't like that. But from his perspective, you could probably understand what he's saying. He's probably saying something along the language of like a kitrug. And that is, yeah, I know it's a story of someone who did a malshinos on me, and we'll see more details about it in a minute. But ultimately, why is this really happening? What's really happening is there's some impure force that doesn't want this smicha to happen, and that's why this story is happening. And so that's probably why he's equating himself to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, that this negativity that's happening to him is maybe as a result of some spiritual claim in heaven that's against him for doing this, and that may be why he equates himself to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. This is what he wrote in Igeres HaSmicha. He then wrote again, he wrote a second kuntras later on, and he doubled down and he said the same story again with a little more dramatic detail, and that is, he says, like, it was much more immediate, because the way it seems from the first letter is that, he gets a report that the government's looking into him, right? So it's not so immediate, but like soon there's going to be a problem. And so he's like, okay, I need a run. So, I'm going to leave next Tuesday and, come next Monday for the smicha. That's based on what we saw now. But in the second letter, which I'm not quoting here, he writes about it in a much more immediate way, that they came to his house and they came looking for him and he had to run away. And now it's like, okay, I can't be home. It's not safe to be home. I need to get out of town now. Oh, but what about smicha? So let me go find these guys. And on the way, as he's running away to Chutz La'aretz, is when he does this smicha. So it's a little more immediate. And when he describes it there, he also comes back and says, similar to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Similar to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib, in his final kuntras that he wrote on this, says, the first time I saw yourself comparing to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, all right, I thought it's, people use that artistic license. The second time you're doing it, it's like, I have a very big problem with this. How could you compare yourself to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? Let's read a little. You yourself said that the reason the Ottoman government was coming after you had nothing to do with the smicha. It was because of malshinim on a private matter. And in fact, I heard from other people the story. And the story, the Ralbach goes on to say, and again, this is rumors, so what exactly happened, we'll never know, because there was never a response to this kuntras. But he goes on to say that Rabbi Yaakov Beirav had a son, and the son had a dispute with someone on some sort of property. And Rabbi Yaakov Beirav got involved on his son's side. And there was a certain bezdin that presided over the case. And Rabbi Yaakov Beirav didn't like the outcome of the psak din and said negative things about this bezdin that presided over the case. And that one thing led to the next, that somehow the other side, I guess, did a malshinus to Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. So he says, that's how this whole story developed. Again, what happened we'll never know, because we're hearing it from Ralbach, who says he heard. Who did he hear from? And how many voices were in between? We don't know, and there was never a response. But this is what he says. It was a real estate dispute that maybe even you were at fault for why it ended up happening. So now you're comparing yourself to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? There, he went into danger to do the mitzvah. And the danger, they came after him because he did smicha. Here they're not coming after you to do the smicha, so he didn't like the equation. Again, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, I think, probably would say, no, it's not the same thing. But for the reasons I explained before, that kind of more spiritual component, some sort of kitro nomaila, could perhaps be what he had in mind. Okay, so now we know Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, a few months later, gave smicha to 4 people, which leads to the question who these 4 people were. So there was a rabbi who lived in Sfas in the late 1800s, early 1900s. His name was Reb Chaim Sashoin, and he has a sefer on halach on Shulchan Aruch called Eretz Chaim. And he has a long piece on this story, but he's writing 400 years later. He's in the late 1800s, he's writing this. And he writes, Kabbalah b'yodeinu, but he was in Sfas. And he writes, Kabbalah b'yodeinu, we have a Kabbalah here in Sfas, that the 4 rabbis are, number 1, Rabbi Yosef Caro, the famous author of the Shulchan Aruch, we spoke about him before, the Rav HaMabit, Rabbi Moshe ben Yosef of Tirani, also a very noted, very famous individual, Rabbi Avraham Shalom, and Rabbi Yisrael ben Meir di Kurial. Okay, all 4 of these are well-known individuals. The first 2 even more well-known, and obviously the most well-known, Rabbi Yosef Caro. This is the shmua that he heard in Sfas. Now, we obviously want more than this, because someone living so many years later saying that's a shmua, obviously they're in Sfas, there's something to it, but 400 years of separation, we want more. We want more evidence that's more contemporary, who indeed received this smicha. So, in 1598, there was a sefer that was published in Venice by Rabbi Yehuda Caro. Rabbi Yehuda Caro was the son of Rabbi Yosef Caro, a very young son, because he was born when Rabbi Yosef Caro was an elderly individual, and he printed a Shilas V'Tshuvas of his father. Shilas V'Tshuvas. And on the title page, it reads as follows. Look at number 9. Sorry, I said Venice, apparently Salonika. It says as follows. Shilas V'Tshuvas lahamoyer hagodol hagoin harav hamusmach. Yosef Caro. So his son calls his father the Rav HaMusmach on the title page of his Shalos V'Tshuvos. Now I need to tell you, Rabbi Yosef Caro published numerous for him in his life after the year 1538. He published the Beis Yosef, he published the Kesef Mishnah, he published the Shulchan Aruch, and he was involved in the publishing. Most of these works were printed when he was alive, and does not say Musmach on any of the title pages. So he didn't put it there. But for whatever reason, in 1598, his son Yehuda, who published this book, Yehuda has like an introduction. When you open the page, the first page, Yehuda has an introduction there, so you clearly see he's involved in the publishing, and he does put the word Musmach, giving credence to this tradition that indeed Rabbi Yosef Caro was one of the people who had this smicha. Another piece of evidence comes from the next generation, and that's Rabbi Yontif Tzahalon, he lived in Sfas. His dates are late 1500s, early 1600s, and he was a student of Rabbi Yosef Caro. And he has a tshuva where he says that in the year Hassam, so the year Hassam, depending on how you want to calculate it, is either the year 1580 or 1585, one of the two, 1580 or 1585. So in those years, there was a Maisa, he says, with the son of Rabbi Yosef Caro. What was the Maisa? His wife died. So he wanted to do Yibum. He died. And his almana needed Yibum. But the father did not want the brother of the deceased to do Yibum, and so this led into a dispute of, are we going to do Yibum? Are we going to do Chalitza? What are we going to do? Which is not our topic for today. That was the story over there. When he says that it was a Ma'aseh b'bnoi shel harav, Rabbi Yosef Caro, he adds the word hamusmach. So here we have a second piece of evidence that indeed, that indeed it is Rabbi Yosef Caro. And thirdly, and this will be both for Rabbi Yosef Caro and for the Mabit, and that's because there was a letter published a number of decades ago. It's a manuscript that's over at the Jewish Theological Seminary. That is a letter from Rabbi Moshe ben Yosef Trani, the Mabit, to Rabbi Yosef Caro. And he's not happy with Rabbi Yosef Caro. And the context, exactly what the circumstances behind the writing of this letter is not entirely clear to me, nor is it 100% relevant. The bottom line is, he wasn't really happy how Rabbi Yosef Caro was treating him and his position in the Rabbanis and Sfas. And one of the things he writes over there, he says, let's go back in time to when we were both learning by our teacher, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. Who did he discuss learning with more? Who did he trust more as a better ma'ayin, as one who's a better researcher or investigator or understander? And who did he ask to join on his Piskei Dinim? And who did he want to give smicha to first? Me, not you. That's what the Mabit is writing to Rabbi Yosef Caro. And then he goes on to say later on, Misha Shas Yodai Al Shnenu, he who laid his hand on both of us, knew that I understand the Gemara just as well as you understand the Gemara. Laying your hand, although smicha after Moshe Rabbeinu is not laying hands, as we learned last week, but still he's using that expression. So you see over here 2 times he's using that lashon of smicha, and here we see that the first 2 people that are in this tradition from Rabbi Chaim Sashon as having received the smicha, we can confirm from other sources that indeed Rabbi Yaakov Beirav gave these 2 individuals smicha. So now you have 2 generations of the smicha. Generation 1 is going to be Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. Generation 2 is going to be Rabbi Yosef Caro and the Mabit, along with 2 other ones. But there's also going to be a continuation into a 3rd generation. Where do we see that? So that brings us to the following sefer. The sefer is called Levushei Srod. It was written by Reb David Shlomo Eibeshitz. He was actually a leader of Hasidus in Romania. He passed away in the early 1800s, but before he passed away, he went to Eretz Yisrael. And he wrote Hagoyis on Shulchan Aruch Choshe Mishpat. Apparently, when he was in Sfas, he came across manuscripts about smicha. And so he copied it into his book that he was preparing for print. And when his book, Levushei Srod, was eventually printed later in the 1800s, these letters were included. And one of the letters is a letter from Reb Moshe Alshich. And Reb Moshe Alshich was a student of Rabbi Yosef Caro. And this is what Reb Moshe Alshich writes. Me'akoyach, from the power that God gave me to give smicha, which I received through Rabbi Yosef Caro, I gave smicha to HaChacham HaShalem Reb Chaim Vital. Reb Chaim Vital is famous as being the star student of the Arizal. And here we're learning about the 3rd generation of smicha, the Reb Chaim Vital. What was that?
4th generation. Chaim Vital.
Oh, yeah, good point. 4 generations. So here we're learning that the Alshich received from Rabbi Yosef Caro, and Rabbi Yosef Caro gave it to Reb Chaim Vital. And as evidence, I'm writing this as a ksav, and I'm giving it to him, and it's dated Esrim L'Chodesh Elul Hei Shin Nun, which comes out to the year 1590, signed by Moshe ben Chaim Alshich. We have this ksav from other places. The chidush says that he saw this in the actual Ksaviyat Kodesh of the Alshich. Okay, so that's 4 generations already of the smicha, and the truth is, we see a continuation, perhaps 1 or 2 more generations in the following. So in the same sefer Levushei Srod, he has a collection of letters that he found in late 1700s or probably the early 1800s that he found in Tzfas. So another letter he has over there is the following. First, let me tell you, it's signed by 7 people. Amongst these 7 people is Reb Yomtiv Tzahalon. And I'm highlighting that name because we had it a few minutes ago, but for another reason. The letter reads as follows. We, the people who have smicha from Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. Okay, this cannot be Rabbi Yaakov Beirav because Yom Tov Sahalon was born after Rabbi Yaakov Beirav passed away. So what are we referring to here? And likewise, the other rabbis over here, some of them were 7 or 10 or 12 years old in 1540s when Rabbi Yaakov Beirav passed away. So the obvious conclusion is that we're dealing here with Rabbi Yaakov Beirav II. Rabbi Yaakov Beirav II, meaning he had an Enokel. Rabbi Yaakov Beirav had a son named Avram. And his son Avram had a son, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. And this Rabbi Yaakov Beirav received smicha from apparently Rabbi Yosef Caro. They knew each other. So apparently he received from Yosef Caro. So all these individuals received from Rabbi Yaakov Beirav II. So they're also essentially a fourth generation because Yaakov Beirav the first, Rabbi Yosef Caro, Yaakov Beirav the second, and then these 7 individuals. But let's continue reading. These 7 individuals, we now agreed that as long as our teacher, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav II, is alive, Shebachol Yemei Harav Rabbi Yaakov HaMusmach, Loi Nuchol Lasmich Shmum Adam. None of us could give smicha. Ki im b'chaburas Harav HaMasmach without him. This is very interesting because the din is you have smicha, you could give it to whoever you want. And here they're making an agreement. Actually, although we have it, we're not giving it to anyone without him. And if anyone does it, it's going to be batal. And they give the date of when they signed this. So it was on a Friday in chidush Menachem, which is Menachem Av. Unfortunately, there isn't a year here. And then they signed their name. Number 1, famous Rabbanim, Reb Moshe Galanti, Rabbi Elazar Askari. He's the author of the Sefer Charedim. Moshe Beirav, Avram Gavriel, Yom Tov Tzahalon, we saw him before, the Shalos HaShuvas of Rabbi Yom Tov Tzahalon. Remember, he's the one who called Rabbi Yosef Caro Musmach. And now we're learning here, he himself was a Musmach, a 4th generation Musmach, and then there's 2 additional names that are here. Now what's interesting about this document is, you could look at this as the beginning of the end. Because you see here an impulse to limit the smicha. Because they're saying, we're not going to do it unless we have permission from our teacher. In other words, there was a feeling of, maybe it shouldn't be such a free-for-all the way it could be or the way it was. And the reality is that there's, a few echoes of conversations of smicha in the first, 2 decades or so of the 1600s, but it's pretty much gone after that. And so that's kind of the feeling that we're dealing here with something that goes on for 4 generations, maybe a 5th generation thereafter, but then there's pretty much no more record of it. But what is that that continues? Is there any dinei knossos? No. Is there any malchus mid'oraisa where they view that they mamish have the koyach to give malchus mid'oraisa? Presumably not as well. So what does it mean it continued? So it's almost like we're carrying, it's almost like a recessive gene. Like we're carrying this power even though it doesn't come out into and influence daily life. Maybe it's an issue of prestige, but it doesn't influence halacha in any tangible way. But that itself is what continues for these 4 or 4.5 or 5 generations. Okay. Now what I want to do now is I want to return to Rabbi Yosef Caro. Because by now we know 3 things about Rabbi Yosef Caro. Number 1, we know he was an advocate. He wrote a sharp letter to Ralbach. That was a gutsy thing for him to do, but he did it because he felt it was important. Number 2, we know he received smicha. Number 3, we know he gave smicha. He gave smicha to the Alshich. Okay, so now let's say, hold on a second. He wrote a lot. He published numerous books, all of them after 1538. Beis Yosef was printed, the first edition of the Beis Yosef was printed in the year 1550. The Shulchan Aruch was printed in the 1560s. The Kesef Mishnah was printed in the 1570s. So is there any influence of the fact that we have smicha, that we brought it back, that he's a musmach? Does that show up at all? The answer is, it's really complicated. And we're going to look at a few different pieces from Rabbi Yosef Caro to show why I think this is complicated. So let's begin in Choshen Mishpat. It says Ohr HaChaim, that's a mistake. Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat, Siman Aleph, the very first din. Says Rabbi Yosef Caro as follows. Bizman hazeh today, donim adayonim dinei hoidois, halvois, ksuvasisha. He gives a long list of things judges could do. So just to pick out a few examples, there's a contested claim about a loan. No problem. Beis Din today could deal with that. There is a contested ksuba. No problem. You could deal with it. Inheritance. No problem. Deal with it. A gift. A dispute about a gift. The Rabbanim will deal with that as well. Torts. No problem. That too. Aval. Kol haknasa shekansu chachamim. When it comes to knas, ein donin oisai ela mumchim hasmuchim be'eretz Yisrael. The only ones who could judge these matters, dinei knases, is mumchim who receive smicha in Eretz Yisrael. This is really interesting, especially when you put it up against what the Torah says. Because when the Torah, in the very first siman, when the Torah is discussing this issue, he says, ha'idna leka smicha, there's no smicha, so we don't do dinei knases. You'll notice Rabbi Yosef Caro didn't write that. He says, you want to do dinei knases? You need to be a mumcha smuchim be'Eretz Yisrael. It allows for an understanding that there are mumchim in Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't say that there aren't. He doesn't say ha'ina like a smuchim. So this will be an example of maybe the Shulchan Aruch is somewhat influenced in where he doesn't want to say today we don't have smicha. Again, it doesn't mean he's coming out and parading the fact. He doesn't say we do. He doesn't say that we have it bizman hazeh. He doesn't use those words. But it seems like he was dancing around and was cautious not to say we don't have smicha bizman hazeh in Eretz Yisrael. That is a fair takeaway of this first passage in Orach Chaim. However, there's a number of other passages that you need to put that up against, and this is what makes this picture a little blurry. So first is the Beis Yosef, in Orach Chaim Siman Tov Rei Zayin. What he's dealing with here is the minig to take Malkus on Erev Yom Kippur. And the language of the Torah is, the reason a person does this is symbolic. It's supposed to inspire you to do tshuva. Through the Malkus, it's kind of like a meditation. All right? It's a meditation that's going to trigger you to think about tshuva. So the Beis Yosef asks a shayla, why do you write that? Why don't you write something better? That it gives you kapara. We know that Malkus could lead to kapara. After a person receives Malkus, he's clean. In fact, we saw last week that it could even clean you off from a Issachar. So, whether you should have said that or not, but at least use the language of kapara, is the question the Beis Yosef says. Then he goes on and says, although we don't have smuchim, so we don't have real malchus, and we don't have witnesses who come and give hasra, so it's never going to be real malchus. Still, kapara b'miksasu. It's not going to be kapara with a capital K, it's kapara with a little k. So why didn't they write that? And he leaves it as a question. But along the way, what do we notice over here? We notice that he says, Ein lanu dayanim smuchim. He's printing this in 1550. That's 12 years after the Maisa with the smicha. He already received smicha by this time. So is he saying about himself, I don't have smicha? Why is he giving smicha to the Alshich if he's saying, Ein lanu dayanim smuchim? So there's like tension over here between, on the one hand, the implication of Choshe Mishpat Siman Aleph Aleph and this. And then there's another example. Shulchan Aruch Even Ezer, Siman Kuf Ayin Zayin. Again, this was printed in the 1560s. He deals over here with the cases of rape and mafata, where the Torah specifies a certain payments, and they fall under the category of a knas. So says Rabbi Yosef Caro, V'ha'idna she'ein smuchim, because we don't have smicha today and we can't do this knas, so we have to figure out another punishment. We'll figure out other punishments until there's going to be some sort of reconciliation. The point is, he says over here that there isn't smicha. All right. Now, what makes this picture even more interesting and complex is his Magid Meisharim. The Magid Meisharim is a very interesting sefer. Turns out, Rabbi Yosef Caro kept kind of a diary about a voice that he consistently heard coming from within his own mind, and a voice that he kept on hearing. It's usually the Mishnayos that he's learning that's talking to him. I'm the Mishnayos. In other words, some you want to refer to it as a ruach, as an angel, as a I don't know. I don't have experience with these types of things, and it shares with him a lot of secrets in Torah. It also tells him about the future. So very interesting. It goes under the category in a certain sense as a Kabbalah sefer. There's a lot of Kabbalah in there. And I don't believe he published it during his lifetime. Long after, I believe it was after he passed away that this was published under the title Magid Meisharim. So he has a passage over there, and he gives us the date, early Yom Shabbos. So I guess it's Friday night. Hey Nissen, Hey Nissen Shnas Hey Shin Gimel. That's 1543. 1543 is 5 years after the Maisa of the Smicha in 1538. Says this voice to him, I am going to exalt you, that you are going to become a prominent leader over all of Jewry in Arabistan. So Arabistan is, in this period, they referred to the Ottoman Empire as this huge empire. And there's the section of, that's Turkey today, but then there's the section that's covering the Arabian Peninsula. So that section of Ottoman Arabia could have been called Arabistan, and was called Arabistan. And it appears that Yidden in these Kehillis, Tzfas was a major center, and Shilas, they're sending where? They're sending it to Tzfas. And it seems that that's the voice is telling him, you are going to be, I guess, the leader of Yiddishkeit in Tzfas, and so by definition, you are also going to be the leader of all of Jewry, Shebamalchus Arabistan. Then he goes further, the voice, and tells him as follows. Because you had Mesiras Nefesh to bring Smicha back, I think we know what this means. He had those letters, those sharp letters that he wrote to a rabbi who was older than him, Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib, that I think that's the Mesiras Nefesh. It could be there's other things, but at the very least it should include that. So because you did that, Tiske Eliyos Musmach Mikol Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, you are going to have the schus to one day get smicha from all the rabbis in Eretz Yisrael, Umei Chachmei Chutz La'aretz, and from the rabbis in Chutz La'aretz, Ve'al Yodcha Achzir HaSmicha L'Yoshna, and through you we're going to bring smicha back. Then he goes on to say, and you're going to finish your work, you're going to successfully finish Beis Yosef, because he's in the editing process of the Beis Yosef at this point, and then you're going to be Zoicha, to be burnt al Kiddush Hashem. So this theme that Rabbi Yosef Caro is going to die al Kiddush Hashem pops up a lot. I shouldn't say a lot. I saw it in 2 or 3 places. Maybe it appears more. In Magid Mesharim, I don't know how it often appears, but it definitely appears at least a few times, that you are one day, the Magid tells him, going to be Zoicha to die al Kiddush Hashem. But Paul it didn't happen. But that's not our main point here. Our main point over here is what the Magid, this voice, tells him about Smicha. And you'll notice it tells him things about Smicha that I think Rabbi Yaakov Beirav would not have been happy to hear. Because the first thing it says, Al Yodcha Achzer HaSmicha L'Yoshim, through you it's going to come back. Implying what happened 5 years ago didn't bring anything back. It didn't bring it back. You're going to bring it back sometime in the future. I don't think Rabbi Yaakov Beirav would have been too happy to hear this. Moreover, how is it going to come back? So it is going to use the method of Rabbi Yaakov Beirav and the Rambam. It's going to use the method not of Mashiach or lost tribes or anything. It's going to use the method of consensus. So I think Rabbi Yaakov Beirav will be happy about that. You're going to use the consensus method, but it's Kol Chachmei Eretz Yisrael. That word is not an accident. Because his Rebbe held you didn't need everyone. Majority is enough. And here the voice is telling him, you're going to get everyone. I think Rabbi Yaakov Beirav was like, everyone, everyone. Who needs everyone? Moreover, it says you're also going to get Chachmei Chutz La'aretz. You're also going to get the rabbis in Chutz La'aretz. What's really interesting about this is that amongst the many things Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib said, and we didn't cover all the arguments last week, one of the things is he brought up this svara. He brought up a svara that really, we know the Rambam said, he gives the idea, all the rabbis in Israel, and then the Rambam said, in Mishnah Torah, V'adavar tzarech echreya. We have to still work this out. Why do you still have to work it out? So Rabach said, you could say many ways, and maybe at Charot on the whole idea. One of the things Rabach said is maybe he's saying, I don't know if the rabbis in Israel is enough. Why? Because if you bring Smicha back, it impacts world Jewry. Because if a rabbi could get Smicha in Eretz Yisrael, he could then go to Chutz La'aretz, so he could do Dinei Knossos there. So suddenly, the Yidden who are living in Spain or in other places, no Yidden living in Spain at this time, but the Yidden that are living in other places, they're going to be impacted. And also, there's always Yidden making Aliyah and they're coming to Eretz Yisrael. So it's going to impact them. So maybe it's not enough just to have the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael. Maybe you need the rabbis of the whole world. And that's why the Rambam said, Adavar tzarech echreya. Who says that? Rabach. What happened over here? Rabbi Yosef Caro's Magid tells him that you're going to get in the future, not only going to have all the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael, you're going to have all the rabbis of the whole world. I think in 3 ways, these are very, very sharp words that Rabbi Beirav didn't want to hear. Number 1, we weren't Machzer Achzir HaSmicha L'Ator L'Yoshna yet. When you will. Number 2, it's going to be all the rabbis in Eretz Yisrael, something he didn't want. And in fact, it's going to be all the rabbis in the whole world, which is an argument that Rabach used to explain the Rambam. So, in a sense, I feel like this passage in Magid Mesharim is moving us away from legitimizing the smicha that happened 5 years before. So this turns a little bit into a mess. So on the one hand, we have Rabbi Yosef Caro fighting for it and receiving the smicha. Most importantly, giving it to someone. We have evidence that he gave it to someone. What are you giving if you're very ambiguous about it and you yourself are not sure about it? And So I don't know. And then in the Shulchan Aruch, he says clearly, Ein Smuchin. There's a little bit of a puzzle over here. And in my head, I tried putting it together in 5 or 6 different ways. And you could do that, but I felt that each way was like very lav dafka, very lav dafka. So I'm just going to leave these pieces of the puzzle on the table, and I'm not going to try to put them together. I'm not going to try to work this out. I'm going to leave that for you. Let's continue. Let's move on to the next part of the shir is to move to the next generations. And that's us. So what's the point? The point is like this. Throughout the generations, many Rabbanim weighed in on this issue. It was a very celebrated dispute. It raises so many side issues come up, and many Rabbanim weighed in. Was Rabbi Yaakov Beirav right? Was Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib right? And it's not all or nothing, because there are so many points. So in other words, before Mashiach, is it coming back before Mashiach or after Mashiach? Could we use a consensus model or not? If yes, do you need everyone or somebody? Etc., etc., etc. There's so many issues that were discussed. And many Rabbanim came out on one side or the other. We're not going to have the ability to look at everyone. I want to look at 2 rabbis, 2 Rabbanim. The first is the story of Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov, because this happens to be a fascinating story of the 1800s. Okay, so who's Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov? He is one of the younger students of the Gra. The Gra passed away in the late 1790s. A number of his students then went to Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov went to Eretz Yisrael in 1810. Most of the time he's living in Tzfas. Okay, so Tzfas is going to be very central to the story here again. And what happens is that in 1830, he sends a messenger to greet and meet the lost tribes somewhere on the Arabian Peninsula, in the area of Yemen. There's shmuas, there's rumors. I should point out that throughout the centuries, every few decades, there's another echo or another voice or another rumor about the existence of the lost tribes, and there's a long history going back a very long time, but by the time you come to the 1830s. And he says, you know something? Let's actually send a shlichus to them. So he writes a letter, and he gives it to the shliach. And then he sends a copy of this letter to the Jewish community in Amsterdam. Now what happens is in Amsterdam, this is bestseller stuff. If you have a letter being sent to the 10 lost tribes, put it under the printing press, and you can you can publish it, and you'll probably make a little money, because everyone's interested in this. People are very curious about the lost tribes. And that's exactly what happened. And so there is a kuntres, and there are copies that exist today, that's called the Geras HaShlucha Mechachme V'Rabbanei HaAshkenazim Shebe'eretz Yisrael, and it was published in Amsterdam in 1831. I'm not entirely sure. It doesn't have a title page with a proper date on it. And this is the letter. Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, Hey Alafin Tov Kuf Tzadik Aleph, that comes out to the year 1830, Lebriya Soila. So there's so many honorifics. We're going to cut to the chase here. Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov is the first one who signed the letter. Presumably he's the one who authored the letter. We're sending the shliach. His name is Baruch ben Shmuel, and he's going on Mesiras Nefesh to move around in the lands and on the sea and in the deserts until God brings them to your kingdom. Now, what do we want from you? We want 3 things. Shalish Heina Asher Navakesh. There are 3 things that we want from you from the lost tribes. First, the first request they say, we're not good daveners. We need, you guys are probably great tzaddikim and you have clear minds. Please daven for us. Number 1. Number 2, shenis. Let's read this carefully. Kenoida b'shar bas rabim. It is well known. Mipnei rabbeinu ha'akdoshim. I don't remember that. Maybe from our rabbis. Ki terem yovoi Mashiach tzidkenu. Before Mashiach comes, there needs to be smicha before Mashiach comes. Who are they quoting here? They're essentially quoting the Rambam and Pirush HaMishnayos. By the way, the Rambam Mishnah Torah didn't say this, but the Rambam Pirush HaMishnayos said you need to have smicha in order before Mashiach comes. And Rabbi Beirav, we saw last week, this is a big impulse for him. And remember, he's saying, if you don't do this, you're being ma'akev the geula. So Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov is in Tzfas, and he says that this is a truth. In other words, there's something in the water in Tzfas, I think, that leads to this conclusion. Due to our many sins, and the difficult decrees, we lost smicha. You need smicha from someone who receives smicha. In other words, we don't accept the consensus model of recreating which the Rambam suggested. So half the Rambam we accept. It needs to come back before Mashiach. The other half we don't accept, presumably because the Rambam himself, a Mishnah Torah, said, V'adavar tzarich echreya. So what are we going to do? And we hear that you guys have Sanhedrin. How do we hear? Because now to be on the Sanhedrin means you have smicha. How do I know that you guys have Sanhedrin? Shadei Danin Din and Afashis. The stories that would come to Europe and to the Middle East about the lost tribes very often included notes about their autonomy and their victory in battle. And part of the autonomy is, one of the ways you're independent in the Middle Ages, you could do Dandin and Efashas. That shows you're Mamash HaMelech, if you're able to do that. So this was often highlighted. So they're saying, looking at it through a Torah model lens, if they're doing Din and Efashas, it means they have a Sanhedrin. If you have Sanhedrin, it means you have Smicha. Therefore, here's their second request. Yivcharuna kama mechachmei masmuchim. Please choose some of your rabbis. V'yavoi no le'eretz Yisrael, and let them come to Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the idea, and there are sources like the tribes are lost in a way that they cannot ever come back before Mashiach. That's not something that he accepted. It's just a question of locating them and bringing them back. V'yismachu le'talmidei chachamim kedei sheyimatzei. Based in Smuchim Eretz Yisrael, they're going to give smicha, and then we're going to have smicha in Eretz Yisrael. Asher tchilas hageula tluya bazeh. Jump starting the redemption needs this. By the way, on a completely different note, we once around this table spoke about Rabbi Kalisher's attempt to reinstate Karbonis in the late 1830s. It's the same decade. And if you remember, he was saying you cannot have Mashiach without Karbonis. So it's really interesting because it's the same decade. Different argument. You cannot have Mashiach without smicha, and so he attempts to do this to get it back. Then they go on to the third request. The third request is that money. We need your money. And basically, how do we survive in Eretz Yisrael? Through the Koilim network from Europe. The problem was they were coming from Lithuania. In the 1830s, the Tsar, was the new Tsar Nicholas I, was very bad for the Jews, the Cantonist decrees and many others. And as a result of the financial situation was very difficult, so money was coming less to Eretz Yisrael. So they're like, okay, we need a new source of income. If we could locate the 10 tribes, that could be a new source of income. And this is the third request that they ask, and they conclude their letter saying, Koi divrei achechem, and there's 4 people who signed. The first one is this, Yisrael. He's again Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov. His label is Mamuno Mashkiach the Koilol Aprushin Sheberetz Yisrael. This is the letter. What do you see here? It's a combination of Rambam and Radvaz. Radvaz, if you recall, I said earlier, Radvaz said maybe the Bnei Reuven before Mashiach coming, they're coming. It looks like they're somewhat inspired by that idea. The Bnei Reuven, just instead of waiting for the Bnei Reuven to come to fight a war, they're going looking for the Bnei Reuven. But it's essentially using that Radvaz, but they're also using the Rambam. This must happen before Mashiach, and that seems to be what's happening here. The Radvaz wasn't published; it wasn't printed yet in the 1830s, but it could be it existed in manuscript. I didn't look too much into this. What was the end of the story? The end of the story was this shliach Taka went. Later in Eretz Yisrael, there was a machloikas that broke out, not around the merits of whether this was a good idea or a bad idea. The surviving evidence was that people called into question the standards of this shliach, whether he was frum enough, and that was an issue. And so there were some rabbis who weren't too thrilled. The bottom line is he made it to Yemen. He was there for a while, and then a later letter from Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov, which also went to Amsterdam, was also published and also went around, and people were very curious about this, was that he was killed over there in Yemen. The circumstances of how that came about need not concern us now, and that was pretty much the end of the story. This is an example of a rabbi taking a position. Most of the Rabbanim who took positions in the centuries that followed, it wasn't Negei L'Maisa. For him, it was Negei L'Maisa, and this was the position that he took. Now, there's an obvious question that you have when you read this, which is the same obvious question we had on the Radvaz, and that is, Smicha is only in Eretz Yisrael. So how do you have the Aseres HaShvatim doing Smicha? So you can ask the question on the Radvaz, you can ask the question on Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov. So the truth is, the first place I saw this letter was in a was a book called Igris Eretz Yisrael, printed by a man named Avram Yari. I think it was printed in the 1950s, where he collected a lot of letters that were written by Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael to other places, and this is where this letter was there. And in this version of the letter, there was actually an answer to the question. And it almost looked like Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov answered the question. There's a parenthesis, and it says, he says a few things. I'll focus on the first few words. He holds that we don't pass like Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that you can only do smicha in Eretz Yisrael. And it almost looks like Rabbi Shua, that Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz is writing that to the Chachamim, to the 10 tribes. You guys don't hold like Rabbi Shua ben Levi. That's what it looks like, the way it reads in the letter. It was just very odd, because quoting a Gemara, quoting a daf to them, earlier in the letter, he's explaining to them what the Gemara is. And now he's already quoting the Gemara. It just, something looked off about that. When you check this original letter as it went around as a pamphlet in the 1830s in Amsterdam, you actually see that there's the letter, and that parenthesis is added in a tiny little font. In other words, whoever was the rabbi printing this in Amsterdam realized readers are going to have this shaila. And so he gives an answer. The answer that he gives is, maybe they don't hold, like it's not a din in the Torah that you can't do smicha in Chutz La'aretz. It's a din of the Gemara. Okay, so maybe the 10 tribes, they disagreed with that. They have a right to disagree with that. Okay, so that's a answer to this question. Maybe that would be the Radvaz's answer as well. I don't know. But anyway, it did throw me off, because it didn't make sense that was part of the answer. And then I realized Taka is not part of the answer. It wasn't clear in that work, but you go back to the original. Sometimes going back to the original helps. You go back to the original, you see very clearly it was the editor in Amsterdam who put that in there. Now, the final section for today is the comments that the Rebbe made about this. And in a sense, just like for Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov, it actually was a relevant question. In a sense, in the second half of the 20th century, it also was a relevant question, as we're going to see. Now, what's interesting is that this issue of the story of chidush hasemicha in the 1530s, the Rebbe mentioned this numerous times. And it was interesting, because the Rebbe seems to show a bias toward the side of Rabbi Beirav. I'll show you a few examples. Look at the Sichas Chelek Test, page 105. The Sicha concludes by saying, "As a Zayin is going to be the time of Shiva Shevtaich Kevarishayna, I will return your judges in the Geula Amitis Vashlema Dorch Mashiach Tzidkenu." So, about this, there's going to be Vashiva Shevtaich Kevarishayna with the Geula. Then there's a footnote, Ha'ara 74, where the Rebbe writes, "Shezeh Yioid Lifnei Boy HaMashiach." That's going to happen before Mashiach. Why? Because the pasuk says, "Vashiva Shevtaich Kevarishayna Acharei Yikar Lochirat Tzedek," which the Rambam said that's Bias HaMashiach. That's the coming of Mashiach. The Rebbe takes that as a given. Quotes the Pirush HaMishnayos LaRambam. There's a Radvaz, a different Radvaz, not one we quoted today. There's another Radvaz that actually talks about Mashiach coming first and then having smicha later. Says the Rebbe, yeah, I know, because the Radvaz holds the other way. So it's fine, so the Radvaz is allowed to hold the other way, but I'm still allowed to say that it's going to be differently per the Rambam. So the overall feeling of this is, I know there's disagreeing opinions, the Radvaz disagrees, but Beseder, I could still say, as a matter of fact, chidush hasemicha is going to be before Vashiva Shevtaich Kevarishayna is going to be before the Geula. That's an example of leaning in the direction of Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. Here's another example in a footnote in Sefer HaSichos Tafshin Beis, page 438 in Ha'ara 157. It states as follows: Yodua Shitas HaBeis Yosef b'divrei Rambam. The position of the Beis Yosef about the Rambam is well known, but again, l'smicha b'zman hazeh, that it's something that could be done. Where do we see that this is the shita of the Beis Yosef? V'ad Beis Yosef kibul smicha ma'amari Beirav, because he accepted the smicha. So if he accepted the smicha, that means, at least at the time, he agreed with it. V'zeh lashon Rambam. The Rebbe goes on to quote the Rambam in Mishnah Torah, Nira li advarim, and he quotes the whole halacha that if we want, we could reconvene and we could recreate the smicha. And he ends lismoich la'acherim, end quote. And you know which words the Rebbe leaves out of this footnote? V'hadavar tzarich hechreya. It's gone. It's not there. So first of all, he's talking about the shit of the Beis Yosef is you could do it. He quotes the Rambam, chooses to end the quote before V'hadavar tzarich hechreya, goes on to quote the Pirush HaMishnayos, It sounds like the Rebbe is coming down on that side. Chazara, that smicha could be recreated by consensus, number one. And number two, it's going to happen before Mashiach. And I give you two examples. There are other examples. You look at other examples. I'm not going to say every single one, but the Rebbe spoke a lot, and this issue came up. It does seem often to kind of go in that direction. However, the context is always theoretical. It's never, and therefore we should be doing A. It's never about initiating some sort of program, bizman hazeh, to bring Mashiach or anything of the sort. And in fact, when it came up to be Lamaisa, we see the Rebbe going the other direction. So where do we have that? In 1951, Rabbi Levi ibn Maimon, otherwise known as Rabbi Fishman, who was the first religious affairs minister in the state of Israel, he put out a sefer that's titled chidush haSanhedrin b'Medinaseinu haMechudeshes, renewing the Sanhedrin in our new country. And on page Kuvav of this work, he says he recounts the story that happened in Tzfas, and he says, yeah, Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib was against it. You know why he was against it? He says, because it was an elboin against Biras HaNetzach. How dare you? Yerushalayim is the eternal capital of the Jewish people, and the fact that you guys did it there and it didn't happen here, that's why I'm against it. All the halachic things, that's just superficial stuff that was said, klapei chutz, which was halachic issues, but don't take the halacha too seriously. This was really about undermining the value of Yerushalayim. Why is Rabbi Fishman saying this? Why is he saying this? Because he wants to bring the Sanhedrin back. Ralbach was against it. How do you marginalize Ralbach? How do you basically say don't take him seriously? Just say he was offended with the fact that it wasn't Yerushalayim. Today we have Yerushalayim. In 1951 we could do it in Yerushalayim. So he's saying if Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib walked in today, he would say, yes, let's do it because we're going to do it in Yerushalayim. This is a very, very difficult thing to say. To say that Rabbi Levi ibn Chabib, his only issue was Yerushalayim, and all of his halachic reasoning was superficial excuses. To say something like this is a very, very difficult thing to say. But Rabbi Maimon really, really, really wanted to bring the Sanhedrin back. He really wanted to do that, and I think he wouldn't have stopped at anything in terms of getting that done. In fact, there's another thing he does all the way at the beginning of the book. The other thing he does at the beginning of the book is, what about the Rambam? The Rambam in Mishnah Seder says, Hadavar tzarich hechra. He says, there's manuscripts that don't have those words of the Rambam. Hadavar tzarich hechra. There's manuscripts that don't have the word. And he says, see an article published a few years ago by Dov Revel. Okay, so we opened the article by Dov Revel. It was written in the 1930s. And he writes, there's numerous Rishonim. He quotes 3 Rishonim that quoted this Rambam, that nearly hadvarim, that you could bring it back. When they give the quote, they don't have Hadavar tzarich hechra. So Revel said, maybe they didn't have it in their manuscripts, maybe. Now, that's a very big maybe. I hope you underscore that maybe 30 times, because maybe they did, and they just didn't see a need to quote it. In fact, we all know the Lubavitcher Rebbe had that in his version of the Rambam, and we saw a quote before where he also left it out. So it doesn't mean that it wasn't there. Apparently, I don't know if Maimon ever saw actually a manuscript without it. I think he just guessed based on that. Why? Because we don't have manuscripts that don't have it. All, if you look at the Frankel Rambam in the back, they bring from many different manuscripts. They don't bring any manuscript any reliable manuscript that doesn't have those 3 words. And likewise, Rabbi Kapach's edition of the Rambam and Moshe Shilat's, not Moshe, but Yitzchak Shelat's edition of the Rambam. All these, they do so much research in terms of all the Kisvei Yad. No one ever suggested that these, I'm not saying there isn't a single manuscript where it's not there, but it definitely is not one that should be taken seriously. But I'm just showing you that Rabbi Maimon he really wanted this, and so he threw that out in the front of the book, like, don't take Hadavar tzarich hechra too seriously, and likewise toward the end of the book, he's like, if we could do it in Yerushalayim, then it wouldn't be a problem, because Ralbach wouldn't have a problem. And it is to that movement of being Mechadish the Sanhedrin in our day, which would require Semicha, that the Rebbe has a letter penned in the Elul of Tafshin Chav Ches to an Israeli journalist by the name of Eliyahu Amika. And it's a long letter, and basically the main point is, people say you need the Sanhedrin in order to know how to observe Jewish law. Sorry, not true. We know how to observe Jewish law even when there isn't a Sanhedrin. in order to reduce machlokes between communities. I don't know, is it that important to reduce machlokes between communities? The different communities have different standards. Is really the end of the world? Then, as the letter goes on, the Rebbe seems to address what's really motivating at least a segment of the people who want to bring the Sanhedrin back. Says the Rebbe as follows. It is a great mistake for those people who are saying that through bringing the Sanhedrin back, we're going to remove chumris. And many isurim in the individual life or the life of the tzibur are going to go away. Here he's saying. There are people who are saying, we have a new state of Israel, we have a country, we have modernity. If you could bring the Sanhedrin back, you could change halacha. Is that true? Well, theoretically it's true. Why? Because certain dinim that Chazal darshan through the Yud Gimel Midrash Atar and Drashas Bam, if a later Sanhedrin wants to overturn it, it could overturn it. So people know that Sanhedrin has certain powers. It's a sugya shlema what exactly they could overturn and how. But at least it's a theoretical possibility. So the Rebbe is saying it's a mistake to think that that's going to happen. Number one, it's a mistake to even want kulis, where it's coming from shridus halev and prikus oil of musar. So that it's coming from a bad place. But also, it's just not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. Why? The Rebbe doesn't tie choice here, but I think, of course, theoretically, a Sanhedrin could overturn a law. But let me tell you how it doesn't work. It doesn't work that because in the 1960s there's a new value in general Western society, so now we go back and we change the halacha. That's not how it's going to work. If Chazal, hovering over their Gemaras, they saw a Kal V'chomer that was done in the previous generation, and now they came up with a new pircha to the Kal V'chomer which changes it in, then theoretically, how often is this going to happen? And it's an academic exercise. It doesn't flow from the New York Times editorial pages. And that's what I think he's saying. Like, these change, it's not going to happen. So number one is coming from a bad place. In other words, imagine someone's in a relationship and they're trying to change someone about their partner. So what would we say? I think we would say that that's not a healthy relationship. Same thing with Yiddishkeit. If there's something you're trying to change about Yiddishkeit, so it means that there's something wrong that's going on over there. And the other thing the therapist is going to say, you could try to change someone else. It's not going to happen. Theoretically, is it possible? Yeah, but practically, it's not going to happen. So I'm saying the same here. It's not going to happen. Then he goes and says, it's a mistake. All the people who think that this is going to bring Shomrei Torah mitzvahs and the non-frum, it's going to unite them. How? Because if we do less Jewish observance, so then we bring observant Jews closer to non-observant Jews. No, that's a big mistake. The Rebbe says it's very clear that even if you brought the Sanhedrin back, the 39 malachas on Shabbos are still going to be there. The dinim of ishus and tznius are going to be there. There aren't going to be any compromises in Jewish education, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so here he's really hitting on the underlying motive of why some people want to bring the Sanhedrin back, and obviously, therefore, it's going to be against it. But then the Rebbe continues and says, okay, but what about halacha? Let's put motives aside. Could we bring the Sanhedrin back? The Rebbe is very short on the halachic point. The Rebbe just says anyone who studies the laws of who can nominate for the Sanhedrin and who could be part of the Sanhedrin will be very, very clear that just like there couldn't be a Sanhedrin from the day that it ceased to exist to today, so too all of those obstacles are still in our path today. This is very similar to one of the points Ralbach made. We saw last week, Ralbach said, you need to be a certain caliber person, Sinai and Oiker Harim, and we saw Rabbi Beirav got offended when the implication was that he isn't roy to have Semicha. Well, the Rebbe here is using a similar type of argument that we don't have the people today who could either nominate or be on the Sanhedrin. And then the Rebbe concludes and says, the true preparation for chidush Sanhedrin is that when everyone betters their Judaism, and then we're going to be Mekarev, the Gula, Amitis, Aidei, Mashiach, Tzidkenu, then you're going to have Oshiva Shotai Kavarishanim V'yatzai Kavatchila. What does it sound like here? When are the judges coming back? After Mashiach. So earlier in those other letters, the Rebbe seemed to embrace more, the other Sichias, the Rebbe seemed to embrace more Rabbi Beirav's position. When it came L'maisa to a question of chidush Sanhedrin, the Rebbe seems to go in the other direction. I think academically, maybe, Rabbi Beirav had a lot going for him. The Rebbe sees value academically, but practically speaking, I think the Rebbe did not like even the conversation of this idea, even thinking about this as something practical. And in that regard, better say, Mashiach will come, then there's going to be the chidush of the Semicha and the chidush of the Sanhedrin. So this is another example of subsequent generations going back And weighing in on this what was a heated dispute in the 1530s, continued being discussed b'meshech hadoros ad hayom. And we saw two examples. We saw the example in the 1830s of Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov, and here we saw the more recent conversation and the letters and the sichos that the Rebbe had on this subject. Okay.